South Africa right now is in a time of economic crisis, and within the governing party itself, the African National Congress, we see what perhaps we haven't seen in a long time is really quite divergent factions and thoughts coming out of the ANC. So it's perhaps a good time now to think about what the ANC of the future might look like, especially if voting and electoral trends continue to be supportive of the African National Congress. We see really four scenarios at play, two scenarios that lead the party and South Africa along with it towards economic prosperity, and two scenarios that perhaps would lead the country towards economic failure. The two along economic prosperity, to talk about the first, is one we've termed the African liger. We do this because there actually is a hybrid species that exists in the world that is half lion and half tiger, but more particularly because the emerging economies out of Africa have been termed African lions, whereas the emerging economies and that have done quite well economically in Asia have been termed the Asian tigers. And we see our own African lion, the African National Congress, or rather our own economy, the South African economy, likely to take the route of growth perhaps of the Asian tigers. If it does this, it would require a very robust and bureaucratic state apparatus that is staffed with highly educated state officials, as we've seen, and would probably requires tighter control and party discipline. This is only possible in a country where the African National Congress decides to take education more seriously, and where the ranks of the civil service are again filled by highly competent staff. It also means that we see a move away from the current factions of the African National Congress towards a party that moves more cohesively as a single unit. That might entail actually a stronger Secretary General, so we see policies coming out of the party apparatus through Luthuli House and from the branches, as opposed to policy dictated by cabinet ministers. This would also present a shift where we're seeing increasingly legislation being given to ministers, and ministers having greater legislative capacity. This is a model that we feel is the least compatible perhaps with civil liberties, as a strong and often dictatorial in some ways government tends to clamp down on other civil liberties such as freedom of speech and dissent that might come through in the media. So it is potentially a path of economic growth, but coupled with a clamping down on perhaps other civil liberties. The one path towards economic prosperity is what we see if we continue towards a path that was formulated before of a post-racial society, so moving towards a rainbow nation. And this is really the leaping leprechaun. So the analogy there is, of course, this leaping leprechaun, this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And this of South Africa can somehow come towards a post-racial society, meaning that we move past the racial blame that we often place in terms of the failure of the economy and the political scenario, and we can come to a compromise that really pulls in all stakeholders of society, and where we see the private sector as not an enemy of the people, but really a key ally in terms of achieving economic growth, where we see market-led and private sector-led growth, but really with a strong government that is able to help and assist the most vulnerable in society. The two paths towards economic failure we see is perhaps an ANC that moves towards far more tyranny of the left. So we see really the worst kinds of interpretations of radical economic transformation, where that's taken to perhaps its worst logical conclusion, and that is perhaps expropriation of land without compensation, it's patronage by proxy, so a politically connected and wealthy black elite who continue to wager deals in favor of themselves as proxy beneficiaries for really the mass and millions of really poor South Africans. And that's where a racial dialogue becomes further entrenched in society. The last possibility of a path that would lead us towards economic failure is really a breakup scenario. So whilst this might engender almost a splinter group, is where there's another spin-off of the ANC, of the like we've seen in the past of a Congress of the People, or perhaps an EFF. So a splinter group that comes from the current governing party, but perhaps more like COPE, in that it would probably splinter away because of disagreements in terms of ideology, but it would lack the kind of charismatic leader that the EFF has had, and for that reason it would probably be a failure at the ballot box. But such a further splinter group would probably then only begin to present a scenario in which we may see a coalition government and the African National Congress come below 50% vote. So whilst a splinter group scenario might at first create more confusion and less policy coherence in South Africa, it might start to pave the way for a coalition government and perhaps a truly mature democracy where we move away from a hegemonic one-party rule but towards a multi-party democracy with a constant changeover of political governing power with each election.